Hello and welcome to Echo, our design meeting. Today, a bunch of the core members online, and we'll be reviewing our latest pull requests, some new features that we have to support the varieties of hardware implementations and IPMI implementations for our new Quarks feature. And we'll talk a little bit about the salt jig. I'll demonstrate some of my chef metal progress, and we'll review some of the crowbar versus cobbler talking points. But first, let's review a little bit of our agenda, see what folks got done, if there's anything on the previous agenda that needs attention. And it actually looks all good that we covered everything. I might also want to cover the in-band and out-of-band features and just get that review that nomenclature and how it relates to the product again, so everybody is super clear. It's a potential point of confusion. And also how jigs interact with on activities that are on the graph, that is in the annealer, and activities that are out of band or not in the annealer, and just work out all of that terminology again to beat that dead horse. Anything any other folks want to add?
Sounds good to me. I think we got more than an hour, so material.
So just a quick review of the latest pull requests. Can anybody want to jump in here? I see Randy's that I accepted a few hours ago or last night was just doing some renaming.
Hey, John. Let's focus on design items and save the pull review and backlog stuff for next meeting. Just
no problem.
No problem. That's right. From a design community versus design meeting, I think this is supposed to be a design meeting. So.
Okay. So let's review the Quarks feature.
Okay. Sorry, I'm having to do all this from my phone. As usual, I get back to work and my non-work laptop is having issues getting outside. So, Quarks. One of the things that I added over my enjoyable vacation was the ability for the templates for any of the roles to be able to essentially do to destructure data from Chef or Puppet or wherever to do matching with scoring on it and use that information to essentially look up what quirks, if any, need to be applied to a system for things like the IPMI or the RAID or the BIOS jig to do their work, or the RAID, the IPMI RAID or BIOS roles to do their work properly. Currently, the only place that that's being used is in the IPMI stuff, and we have quirks in place for if a system is a Dell system with a dedicated NIC for the BMC, then whether or not to use that as being managed as a quirk, and the and whether or not how we set up the usernames or the crowbar username for the IPMI interfaces for various IPMI controllers, including some Supermicro and some IBM IPMI controllers, is also being handled as a quirk. And there will definitely be more to come as we expand the scope of what hardware we support.
Does this include general IPMI power on, power off stuff? Do we find quirks in there as well?
If we do, we'll have the infrastructure to handle them. For instance, I know that some IPMI controllers, even when you tell them to do a hard power on or a hard power off, they still go through the full ACPI OS notification cycle, and so you wind up getting a soft power off, which is a bad thing if you want to do things like use IPMI as your fencing technique.
Yeah.
Stonus type things. And so that support for handling that and working around it, if a workaround is in fact possible, would also be handled as a quirk. But in order to add the quirk for that, we need to have detailed information on, who made the IPMI controller, what product ID does it have, what model ID, what manufacturer ID, that sort of thing.
You mentioned destructuring, if I understood you right, data from the chef and Puppet or whatever. Are those considered jig sources or sort of pre-jig?
It's pretty much, I wrote a gem that basically takes any Ruby nested hash that can be translated into JSON and allows you to write a template that will pick out and match things from that nested hash and assign scores as to what it found and how much stuff it matched. So you can essentially, take everything you got back from Ojai and run 10 or 20 matchers over it and determine what quirks you need to apply to a system based off of which matchers have the highest score.
Hey Victor, that sounds a little bit like Razor. Is there a similarity with that?
If there is, hang on, let me finish talk. Oh, that's Iona. Whoever is echoing. Okay, is that any better? Yes, awesome. If it looks like Razor, it's completely coincidental. I actually got my inspiration for how to do that based off of work that I did for back when I was the maintainer of PM utils, and I had to manage a quirk database for how to appropriately touch all the weird video cards that exist in such a way that they don't explode when you're suspending and resuming your system. I did something similar for them, and I just generalized that a little bit and applied some stuff that I picked up when I first found the destructuring bind set of macros in Common List.
Cool. No, that's awesome. What I would expect is that some of will satisfy some of the Razor use cases. Not all of them, because I know that they do it for different reasons. That's really cool. Well,
for what we're using it for, I'm using it mainly just to figure out any oddities of the hardware that we're talking to, and be able to accommodate that in our code base without sprinkling everything with special case exceptions that on a machine by machine basis. I'm trying to set it up in such a way that we do it as that we have ample opportunity to generalize and force better documentation just by the fact that we have quirks available for that specify what exactly we're going to do for any given model of hardware.
Cool.
Yeah, I might have missed it when I dropped off, but this is not a heuristic pattern to match particular roles, but rather just for operational control of the hardware itself. So roles can be applied in a uniform fashion.
The way it's working right now is pretty much whenever we're doing stuff that's hardware specific, that's generally split into at least two phases. There's a discover phase, and then there's an actual configure the hardware phase. And during discover phase is when we figure out what set of quirks the system needs to use in order to appropriately manage whatever hardware it is we're discovering. And we add that to a list that lives on the node, and that list gets passed into the attribute data that we put in the system that the configure phase uses. And then the chef recipes or whatever can look at the list of quirks that are applicable to the system and tailor their behavior accordingly.
So that quirks list is automatically generated for every run. Every node role execution is going to have the quirks list. Okay. All right. The roles have to ask for quirks?
No, they get it.
They just get it. Okay. Okay. So as the system as we add more systems into it, the quirks list for each system will grow. And it's very
well,
the spectrum of non-quirk, yes.
I'm trying to keep it from being a. Oh, that loop.
It's me creating the loop. I'm sorry. I'll mute when I'm not talking.
I'm trying to keep it from being a defined per system quirk list. It's actually a per piece of hardware quirk list. And the quirks that apply to a system as a whole are discovered as just part of the hardware, as part of the hardware discover role.
Right. But wouldn't you end up with additional quirks depending on the NIC cards or the RAID cards that were in there?
Potentially. But I'm not going to do something like say, oh, hey, all our 720 XDs need on their quirk list. I'm saying that, oh, this system has an H710 and a Dell IPMI controller, and potentially, it's running at a specific BIOS revision that we know has a bug, and build a quirk list based off of that instead of hard coding it on a per system setup.
This is actually important and reasonable. I was talking to somebody who had some relevant experience in the industry last week, and they were specifically saying, that the quirks issues are one of the most challenging ones to solve. So it definitely adds. It sounds like we're getting ahead of it before we run into the quirk explosion, if you would.
I built one of these before, so I'm trying to avoid the obvious pitfalls.
Have any folks seen in practice certain mixes of hardware causing anomalies that don't exist on that hardware when any one of the pieces is used with another piece? Say a NIC used with a NIC and motherboard combination exposes an issue with a NIC, where on another motherboard it doesn't. So we could potentially need some way to express that.
Yes. Yes, I have seen that. I have, in fact, seen that all the way down to specific firmware revisions of any given piece of componentry, where a bug will only happen if this NIC with this firmware rev is in this system with this range of BIOS rev and this storage card with this firmware rev and due to IRQ sharing. Stuff like that. I've seen that happen.
Will this scoring system allow, quirks like that to surface? So if we're only seeing, failure of this NIC with this firmware version, is that expressed?
As long as facts about the things that we want to write quirks about are present somewhere where we can match against them, then yes.
Okay. So when we discover one, we articulate it by.
It's explicitly designed to be that flexible, because I've needed that level of flexibility in the past when I didn't have it.
Yeah. So a quirk entry itself would be any number of blobs of JSON, and if all or most of those blobs meet, then that particular quirk is applied. And those blobs of JSON could be anything about the hardware or the firmware. Would it also encompass the say OS config that we learned from OHI?
Usually, OS configs don't cause hardware level quirks.
Right.
Of the type that I'm envisioning working around. I mean, there's no reason that it couldn't. I just don't have a solidly defined use case for it yet, and I do have solidly defined use cases for it in IPMI and WSMAN and RAID and BIOS for that matter.
What about the classic example of your virtualization hardware changing your MAC address out from under you and UDEV not responding to that very well and having to go in and remove UDEV entries?
That's totally out of scope for this.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't try to extend this to anything beyond hardware level quirks for now.
Okie doke. It's just it seems like a common pattern. I mean,
it is a common pattern, but I don't want to extend beyond the scope of what we're actually trying to manage with Crowbar.
Okay.
And right now we're not trying to manage virtual machines as such, which is why we don't have support for VirtIO controllers and that sort of thing.
Right. That's all the questions I got. This gem, have you written it as a separate upstream contribution? Or is it
just look for structure match on Ruby Gem.
Cool. What's the gem's name again?
Structure match. No hyphen. Just structure match, one word.
Woohoo! There it is. Excellent.
I even have documentation for developer level documentation.
All right. If there's no more questions, let's move on to the salt jig.
I can proxy for Greg a little bit, although Victor, I know, reviewed the code and I was watching the commit history on it. So the work for the salt jig is is driven to try and basically install a minion and hook it up to an existing Salt server and make that work go. Although Greg's initial pass at that was did a lot more in its capabilities. He was actually building a jig and doing some other, learning Crowbar and doing some other work as far as that goes. But it is a goal for us to be able to have install the Salt minion and then be able to let people manage a node via Salt after we set it up. And so that's where that work is going. If people are interested in doing it, the purpose of this call is to get community participation in that effort. And I know, and I'm actually trying to bring the Salt team into it so they can give us some guidance on it. Victor, you looked at Greg's polls, and I know that he wasn't expecting him to be right the first time. You have any additional comments on that?
Not much beyond what's already in not much beyond what's already in the pull request itself. Based off of one of the last on it, we need to have a better model in place for push type command and control setups like what Salt has versus pull type, which is what Chef has. Because in both Puppet and Chef, the operational model is the client, the client notices the need to do something, and essentially asks the server, okay, what do I need to do to make this happen? And go out and suck all the data down. Whereas in Salt, it seems like it's more the server tells the client, you need to do this. And so we may need to tweak some aspects of how the jig system will work for that.
How much construction do you think it will require?
Not much. It's mostly just a matter of making sure that the Salt minions wind up getting installed properly on the nodes that we have. Currently for Chef and Puppet, we just rely on the fact that we won't need like a Puppet client or a Chef client role on a node until we have a role on that node that requires Puppet or Chef, and then we can automatically pull in the client role as a side effect of that. And then and the logistics around that seems like it'll be a little more complicated for the Salt case.
Okay. There's more infrastructure to set up if we did that, if we had that case. I'm not sure how much Salt infrastructure we actually need to set up. I think that's something we're going to want community feedback on. Go ahead.
It looks like Greg's going the full stack route, which I think is fun.
Well, it's very logical to me for him to do that because in order to test it, he needs the whole stack. For the use case that we're trying to prove, you don't. But I think what he's doing is probably the easier to test and validate, and then we'll have to go back and add in the special case if there's already an existing Salt server.
Well, it looks like it's modularized well enough so that even though we're doing a full stack install, it'll work kind of like the Chef server and Chef client stuff in that the Salt master role can either install Salt master and record that everything should talk to it, or just have information that says you need to talk to something out there.
That will be awesome. That's exactly the one. I like it. No, that should be the pattern. I like that much better.
Yeah, but I'll try to talk to Greg later on tonight about that.
What's Salt's equivalent of OHI or Factor?
I don't know.
There is one. I think it has a salty name to it, like miner or shaker or something like that. Or grains, I believe, is the data collection. I think it's called grains or shaker. I think it's shaker, and the details are called grains. Scott cringes over the tortured analogies that that get pushed into these communities. I don't know that we need it because at this point we're not trying to. I guess you need it for the recipes to work, but the salt server is going to do that. We don't need it. We don't need to collect that data in Crowbar to inform our decisions because it's a little redundant with OHI.
So if we ever start writing, if we ever start writing that like crowbar roles that would rely on a salt minion, then yeah, we would need to have at least some idea of it. But if we're not going to do that, if we're just going to set it up so that, oh, hey, these 100 systems can be managed by this salt server and not care what they're being managed to do, then yeah, we don't need that support.
That sounds good. I think this was a good intro discussion. We'll see if we can get Greg in for the next one.
All right. So moving right along, I made a bunch of progress yesterday on getting Chef Metal hooked up into the work that Rob has done into Crowbar, be able to deploy, allocate and then make ready the machines that are discovered by Crowbar. What Chef Metal lacks is a discovery process. It is just assuming that whatever driver you're using, and a driver could be any source of virtual machines like anything supported by Fog, which would be AWS or Rackspace or OpenStack, or Vagrant, which a Vagrant box resource would have to be created if you're using Vagrant in Chef Metal, and the Vagrant box resource would point to a Vagrant box, let's say your precise64.box Vagrant box, and then that considers it sort of an open pool or a limitless pool to create as many Vagrant boxes as you'd like out of that precise box. There are no boundaries. It seems there are no guides for maximum number of boxes or anything already built into Chef Metal, and I was starting to understand it and see a pattern that might emerge where if Crowbar is now the driver and we have, say, a few nodes that have been discovered in Crowbar, besides the fact of deciding which nodes to bring into an allocated and then ready state, it's how many of these nodes will we be a maximum number of these nodes so a particular deployment doesn't run off with all of the hardware. I thought making a guard initially like that would be really useful because Rob hadn't implemented any Chef resources to support Crowbar and or Chef Metal Crowbar. And oftentimes resources are really good at giving developers and DevOps engineers a feeling of where they exist or how many resources they have or what type of object this is that they can play with. So I've got those basics set up, and I'm now just working on the connect sequence. So these chef recipes and the driver code can actually talk to the Crowbar box. Just getting up to the point yesterday where I was making the call out to Crowbar and authenticating, and then the cafe closed and I ran out of time. the Rob's initial design pattern can remain of moving assets or moving nodes that appear in the system deployment, moving them into some other deployment, say an allocated deployment as an initial step. But the obvious next step is that DevOps engineers are going to want to name this deployment something, or at least to have more of a friendly name for it. So they can create a deployment in Crowbar called by test system and match that deployment in Chef Metal by calling the Crowbar deployment resource, say, test or my test system to match that name. And then we can go ahead and start deploying nodes into that and applying whatever roles are useful. I've got some questions about where and how to overlap some Chefisms, because when a Chef Metal machine resource starts to come up and then it's made ready, it's then made ready means you can SSH into the box and run Chef client. At that point, there's attributes of the machine resource that indicates which recipes and roles you would put on the run list. This starts to conflict or overlap with our Crowbar node role and node role scheme, and I'd like to sort of open up the discussion to how we would want to treat that in a robust Chef Metal Crowbar implementation.
So you're saying that I thought when we run Chef, we do it basically in the Chef 0 mode so that the run list is only for that one node role execution. Are you saying would interfere with the run list from Chef server's perspective?
It could, and I was very concerned about that. I wanted to also drop that in Victor's head to ask him about how we would manage that if Chef Metal is running Chef client on the node to apply certain cookbooks and roles, that is Chef roles. That data, if we point it back to our Chef server, the Chef server that's being run through the annealer, what is that relationship there, and what do I need to look out for? Is the annealer smart enough to look at the Chef server and say, oh, these roles have already been run, or these recipes have already been run on this node? They're already on the node. I don't really need to do anything except maybe try again and ensure that it's idempotently correct.
No, it is not that smart.
All right. So what sort of polarity would ensue?
So first off, don't try to. So it sounds like we need a lock that says that only Crowbar or Chef Metal can be running stuff on the node at any given time. Chef Client, as of Chef 11, should take care of that by itself. I believe they have the logic such that you can only run one instance of Chef Client at a time. But Crowbar assumes that it has control of the node's run list, and it creates a new run list for the node for every node role that we iterate through when we're annealing. And so unless we specifically added a node role that says, hey, here's what Chef Metal wants to do, and bound that into the graph at an appropriate point, then we would not have the appropriate, then Chef Metal and Crowbar would conflict with each other.
Right. It strikes me that if a machine is managed by Chef, we are going to no longer want to touch it. Right.
Yeah, that'd be the issue.
And there's really no reason for us to touch it unless it's being reclaimed and deleted. So we're not actively touching machines unless there's a reason to do it. Actually, from that perspective, you could make the machines not available. We actually have a reserved flag. You could use it.
The reserved flag gates what?
It keeps Crowbar out of the system. So once that flag is set on a node, Crowbar will not do any control on it. The annealer won't do work on a system that has I think it's reserved flag set. It's actually exactly this use case, and I think you could use it like this, and Chef Metal could turn would turn that flag on after it was done, turn it off when you deleted the machine, and then Crowbar could manage it again.
Yeah, so I imagine a scenario where an engineer is changing one of his recipes to say, Chef Metal, it's now a Chef Metal dominated role or a Crowbar role, and that would flow through our API into the reserved flag. Okay.
Right. Well, I think the allocating would end with reserving, and when you deallocate or whatever the action is, it would set that flag back. And in that case, that might actually make it where you don't have to take things in and out of deployments. Just leave them in the deployment and use the flag to indicate that it's been reserved or not. That would actually simplify the code paths and solve this problem for you.
Excellent.
Victor, does that make sense for you? Seem like a logical approach?
Yeah. That's the actual purpose of the flag, though, was, and you're talking about the available flag. I'd originally that flag be more for marking the machine administratively not available, for instance, because a system administrator is doing weird things to it manually, and we don't want Crowbar to step all over what the admin's doing.
Right. No, I think it's a little bit of an abuse of the flag, of the intent of the flag. I think that it's actually what you described it's exactly what we're doing. We're saying, hey, this machine is no longer for Crowbar to manage. But in one case, it was the assumption that it was for administrative work. In this case, we're handing it off to a different control system.
Well, the other way that we could handle that, so what are the prerequisites for running Metal on a system? We want Crowbar to do initial node discovery. We want to do hardware configuration, and we want it to lay an OS down, I assume.
Yeah, and even networking.
Okay,
definitely
yeah.
not. Possibly, actually, probably not. You probably don't need the operational framework, but you do need the DNS. You do need the networking. You need NTP. All the ops, most of the basic ops pieces that need to be in place. It's just like it was allocated through Amazon.
So the even simpler solution then would be to just have a Chef Metal role and make sure that is the last, essentially, the ultimate leaf of that node's node role graph.
Would that keep? The problem is that if somebody made a change to the graph, then that might force some re-annealing activities on that node, which would potentially create conflict.
Yeah, as long as that's the only workload role bound to the node, then the only changes that would happen would be to do things like, oh, you need to update your resolve.conf, or, oh, you need to point to this new NTP server, or things along those lines.
Okay. I don't have a concern about that.
Now, if you expect someone to have it by Chef Metal and, want to try to run, a Crowbar workload on it, then there'll be some problems. But otherwise, as long as the Chef Metal role is at the terminus of, or at least as long as it's at the terminus of that node's node role graph, there shouldn't be any problems because Crowbar will just do its annealing thing, and then once it's finished, it'll just hand control back over to Chef Metal.
Right.
Which isn't even Chef Metal.
Well, when the machine's deallocated from Chef Metal, it's really just Chef control. Chef Metal is just basically setting up a run list. But when that run list is no longer applied, we delete the run list. Chef Metal deletes the run list, hands the control back to us. We would basically tear the system down and re-image it, put it back into a hardware discovery. There's actions that we would take, but you'd want it to go all the way back to Chef Metal as an available resource. I think that this uncovers a slightly different issue, which is that we don't have a way to delete a node role right now. I don't think it's a blocker for this proof of concept. We don't have to solve all these.
We don't have a way until right now. Only because that on.
I understand, Victor. I know it's not a Herculean task. It's just it's not one of the tools in Judd's toolbox right now. So the Chef Metal work is pretty much a one-way action, right? You pull it out of the system pool or an existing deployment. We need to walk it through the deployment end at the Chef node role, or actually, I think for now at the OS deployed. At the OS installed node role, and then we need to add, maybe we need a node role to add in the SSH key that the Chef server expects. We might not, because I think we have an SSH key, we just need to share it with the server. Matter of fact, that node's already registered in the server. All you're really doing is handing the information back to the Chef Metal infrastructure.
There is no Chef Metal infrastructure. That's the great thing.
Sorry, it's a recipe on the server. So the server already has most of the pieces there. It's just a matter of integrating with the APIs. And then telling Crowbar not to tromp on it. But Judd, why don't we wait and see if Crowbar is going to tromp on it, and then cross that bridge?
Yeah.
I think we've identified two or three ways that we can keep Crowbar from chomping on it. Some of them hacky, some of them more elegant. That if we find there's issues, we can resolve it.
Victor, the flag is not the reserved flag; it's the available flag.
Yeah.
We use names for the flags that were more positive. We discussed that in a future meeting. I'm sure or past meeting I'm sure I could find the notes.
All right. So I'm done there. We should move on to the Crowbar versus Cobbler talking points.
Okay. So what I've been coming up with in my reviews is that I think that we need to figure out what it would take to make Crowbar a preferred option over Cobbler. I've looked at Cobbler enough to see that it's much more limited than what Crowbar does, but it's also more popular. And I think we may need to find things to simplify or streamline as a against Cobbler position. Right. It's an entrenched base, and it's got a pretty broad install. And what I want to do is come up with a product list. I'll coordinate with Scott a little bit about this. Come up with a feature list to say, all right, these are features that if we had, we would displace Cobbler. And then I'm planning to engage the community and figure out what their feelings are on this. Effectively do some market studies. So we need to come up with questions. What makes Cobbler interesting? What features are compelling? If we did these features, would that be enough to substitute? I think in a meeting where maybe for the next design call meeting, what we can do is literally I'll have a list ready for this and we can discuss it. So that would be 2 weeks.
Well, we do have 5 minutes left.
We do, but I'm not ready.
Okay.
I meant to send an email about this to discuss, sort of do some research and start a thread. Right. So it's a pretty big, obviously got a pretty broad development community. I don't really know who's maintaining it.
Ages ago, the guy who was letting Puppet do Puppet Lab.
Yeah. No, and it died, and that came back, and now Juju Mass is part of it. And it's Python. And somebody's invested in some site design, so that might be the first thing on our list, to have a website with developer focused guide. All right, Judd, if you want to take a pass at this, that would be cool. But I think we do need to have this is how we work versus the other.
Yeah.
Focus on the Chef Metal stuff if you don't mind.
Yeah, sorry. Do Chef Metal. I will take. This is my video with Scott on it. Because I can run the first versions of the survey. Because I already have a list of people I want to touch about it. Chef Metal, I think, is actually more important because Cobbler doesn't do Chef Metal any more than it does Salt, and so those integrations are going to win us more adoption from the people who can deal with the complexity.
There's also something to be looking for, which is Hamlin.
Yeah. Good old CSV. Interesting for them to take on VMware deployment as their first priority. Smart. If your main thing is deploying images, VMware is the perfect thing to deploy.
Well, the guy who initially wrote Racer, one went to CSV and one went to VMware.
The history of things is always important. That's funny.
So, VMware has an automated provisioning that they're telling instead of taking the hardware, takes an hour and a half.
Yep.
So I guess we're coming to the top of the hour, and wish everybody a wonderful day, and we got through our agenda, and signing off from the Crowbar Community Developer Design Call. You can find us online, and next week for a planning call. Any other commitments for folks? What folks are going to be working on for this coming week? I'm going to be working on this Chef Metal stuff.
I have an upcoming pull request for the RAID stuff that I need to shape, and I need to I need to talk a little bit about design for how I want to do that. Mostly around, do I want to just, if we detect a RAID controller, do I want to automatically configure it with a certain set of RAID levels, or do I just want to leave the RAID configure role in proposed and give other things the time to go in and set that up? And if we're going to do that, is that going to be strictly user intervention for now, or are we going to allow that to be programmatically, or allow the RAID levels to be programmatically chosen by whatever downstream role do wind up finding to the node somehow?
Mm-hmm. So the RAID configuration, how it's selected?
Yeah. And I also need to do a little more, have a design discussion for how well that's going to work with our current model of moving nodes around in deployment. Because right now, if I'm fine with having all the hardware detect roles be in the system deployment because they're not really designed to be modifiable. But things like the RAID configuration and BIOS config and whatnot should really not be in the system deployment. So we would need some mechanism to either not bind them in the system deployment or move them somewhere else as needed.
Could we also be splitting them so that the data, like you're originally suggesting, the data for them would come from downstream roles? It's a little twisted, but that would be the other way to handle it. The role that actually did the configuration was in system deployment, but the data that you wanted for it was in a downstream role. It's a little backwards for how
that makes it hard to fit into the model where we assume that overall, any system not otherwise configured, we want to be at a specific grade level. And to be able to override that on a per deployment and a per node basis. With whatever configure stuff in the system deployment, there's no easy way to override that at all.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Shoot. Those things would end up outside of the system deployment. So that means that your system deployment really ends at Sledgehammer from that perspective?
But that's all we ever really envisioned it for. With the current code, there's no easy way for us to, if we automatically bind like say we want to do RAID configuration, if we automatically bind that to a node after discovering we have RAID controllers we can manage, we don't have a way of putting it anywhere other than the system deployment.
Maybe it's becoming time to create a default deployment. I don't know. That's a great question.
The default deployment wouldn't help the situation really either. Yeah. But like I said, you have a discussion around that.
That's really interesting.
We'll take that offline.
I'll see, Victor, I'll see if we can talk one-on-one on it. I like this topic. It'll expose some interesting questions about the annealer. About the node roll graph, not the annealer. And I'd like Greg's.
The node roll graph, the node roll graph, it doesn't really change that. It's more a question of how we want to be able to move nodes in and out of various deployments.
Right. That makes perfect.
We also had a question on chat asking if there's a mechanism to discover what RAID levels are supported.
We can
Actually,
find that whenever.
I think
yeah,
Victor
but-
answered it by saying that we are only supporting specific RAID controllers, so we'd find it by that.
Well, and all the RAID controllers that we support also know how to return the RAID levels they support, so problem solved.
Right. Okay.
What RAID levels can we support? Ask the RAID controller. And what RAID levels do we support? Well, that's a different matter.
Right. I understand. It's just that we have to do the first one in order to present either to make a decision on what we are going to do or let the end user make that decision. We have to be able to know what we can do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the question becomes...
The default that I had in mind was everything's a JBOD, whether or not it's an actual JBOD or we fake it by having single disk RAID 0. Everything supports that pretty much. Even if they support it by not being a RAID controller.
Yeah, the Dell RAID controllers don't support that, for a fact.
Well, he's talking about faking it.
The RAID 0 non-strength. Okay.
Right.
So
Now,
it's the safest assumption.
Yep. You are correct there. And then becomes the decision. Then you enter the decision matrix of when do we change when the default config is going to be applied or not.
yeah. There are some unresolved questions that we need to do some thinking and discussing offline about.
Okay.
All right, guys. We're way past the top of the hour. We'll shut down the chat and see you all next week. And I'll see you online.
Alrighty. Have fun. Bye.